Thank you so much for joining us on World GIS Day for Steve DeRoy's talk, Indigenizing the Map, Restoring and Reconciling Our Homelands Using GIS. I'm Robert Rose, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Integrative Conservation here at William & Mary. The Institute for Integrative Conservation, or IIC, was launched in 2020 with a mission to empower an inclusive community of thought leaders to create and deliver timely and innovative solutions to the world's most pressing conservation challenges, and to educate the next generation of conservation leaders. We achieved this mission by bringing together a diverse community of conservation partners from across sectors and communities, including NGOs, government agencies, indigenous peoples, local communities, and private corporations to identify conservation challenges. We engage William & Mary faculty, staff, and students across disciplines and schools who bring together unique perspectives and skill sets to find impactful and integrative solutions.
Great. I think I had some, just so I didn't miss anything.
Sure.
So I'm Jennifer Swenson, and I am the new director for the Center for Geospatial Analysis. And just for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a very collaborative space supporting student learning in geospatial techniques and accessibility to these technologies, but for faculty, researchers, and also the broader community. And I just wanted to point out, Aaron is one of our fellows from the CGA on Zoom who's handling the Zoom questions.
At William & Mary, we're also honored to have Steve DeRoy as a member of the Institute for Integrative Conservation Advisory Council. We also have another advisory council member here, Dr. Healy Hamilton, Chief Scientist for the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. The Advisory Council provides essential feedback to the IIC on our strategy, values, and initiatives, and we are grateful for their guidance and advice. Welcome to Healy and Steve for joining us today. Each academic year, the IIC presents a series of lectures and panels centered around biodiversity conservation themes. This year, we bring you events that explore conservation histories and hope. The series of events, including this event, examines the backgrounds of specific conservation challenges and looks at how changing perspectives, new technologies and approaches, and new or newly embraced knowledges are broadening or challenging how we understand and talk about conservation. Through this speaker series, we hope to answer the questions, what is different now, and what gives us hope for the future of biodiversity conservation? The Conservation Speaker Series is made possible through support and collaborations across William & Mary. The IIC thanks the many departments and units for their continued engagement in this series. This event is co-sponsored by the University of Richmond Spatial Analysis Lab and co-hosted by the William & Mary Center for Geospatial Analysis and the William & Mary Society for Conservation GIS student chapter. This event is part of a series of events at William & Mary and the University of Richmond in celebration of World GIS Day. Our sincere thanks to our partners for their contribution to this event. This event is being live streamed to a Zoom audience. Hello, Zoom. And is being recorded. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel in about a week. Questions are encouraged and we will try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. This is for the Zoom audience. If you roll over the bottom portion of the Zoom window, you will see a Q&A icon. Please use that feature to submit your questions to the chat. Please do not use the chat or raise hand functions, which will be disabled for this webinar. This event is being recorded and will be available on our IIC YouTube channel in about a week. Those in our live audience, please silence your cell phones. I now want to hand it over to Kat, who is the co-president of the Society for Conservation GIS William & Mary chapter, who will read the land acknowledgement.
William & Mary acknowledges the Indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands our campus is on today. The Chernohaka Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Patawomic, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members past and present.
Okay, now for the good stuff. Introducing our speaker. Steve DeRoy is from the Buffalo Clan, is Anishinaabe, is that good? Anishinaabe and Saulteaux and is from the Ebb and Flow First Nation and Lake Manitoba First Nation, both in Manitoba. He is an award-winning Anishinaabe professional and entrepreneur with expertise in mapping and geographic information sciences, business development, natural resource management, and project management. He has applied his expertise to lead Indigenous knowledge research for numerous Indigenous groups affected by large-scale energy developments. He is co-founder, CEO, director, and past president of the Firelight Group, and the founder, which we'll hear more about, and the founder of the annual Indigenous Mapping Workshop and Indigenous Mapping Collective. So since 1998, Steve has mentored Indigenous practitioners, conducted risk assessments, built decision support systems and monitoring tools, supported land claims, developed best practices, established consultation processes, facilitated community engagement and planning approaches, and supported negotiations between Indigenous communities, governments, and industries. That's a lot. That's like everything. He is an international speaker and presents at numerous conferences, university lectures, and events. He has supported both Google and Apple to ensure Indigenous lands are represented on their maps, which I was just checking in Peru, and yes, they are there. It's great. Steve is a board member of the Canadian Urban Institute, a moderator of the Open Forum on Participatory Geographic Information Systems and Technologies, and a trainer of the Google Earth Outreach Trainers Network. So without further ado, welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Okay, great. Oh, that's loud. I just wanted to say thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be here today. It's a real honor to be able to share some of my knowledge and experience. I am Anishinaabe. I'm Indigenous to Canada. And I am a product of colonization. I walk between two worlds. One world, which is my ceremonial space, where I'm a cultural leader and a Sundance chief and practice ceremonies with my community. And another world where I'm a professional cartographer, and I work with Indigenous peoples. I'm a business leader and an entrepreneur. So it gives me this weird space that I'm working in between, these two worlds. And so I'm going to share with you today a little bit about the work that I do around Indigenous mapping. I have a lot of information, a lot of slides. So just buckle up and enjoy the ride. Thanks for the land acknowledgement. I really appreciate that. I did do some research on some of the land acknowledgements here in Virginia, and I think you've covered all the tribes, so that's really nice. While land acknowledgements show a recognition and respect for Indigenous peoples, they also oversimplify the complex histories of Indigenous peoples and fail to recognize the ongoing impacts of colonization that continues today. So I advocate that in addition to doing land acknowledgements, that we please take consideration of the following actions to cultivate strong relationships with Indigenous peoples. I'm going to give you 6 examples. 1, give land back to Indigenous peoples. 2, in 1982, the Working Group on Indigenous Populations was established by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. Jose R. Martinez Coco led a study about the systematic discrimination of Indigenous peoples worldwide. It's from this study that the Working Group began to draft a declaration on the Indigenous rights in 1985, based on consultations with Indigenous representatives from around the world. The Working Group submitted their first draft in 1994, and with the formation of the Human Rights Council in 2006, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted in 2007. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what UNDRIP is all about. But the UNDRIP deals with a wide spectrum of Indigenous rights and contains 46 articles as a standard of achievement to be pursued. I call on you to work towards implementing those 47 or 46 articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. 3, In the summer of 1990, a 78-day standoff occurred between, it's also known as the Oka Crisis, and it occurred between Kanesatake protesters, Quebec Police, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Canadian Army. As a result, the federal government established the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1991. Extensive research and community consultations focused on historical and contemporary relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, and had 4 theme areas: governance, land and economy, social and cultural issues, and the North. The resulting 5-volume report was released in 1996 and concluded the need for a complete restructuring of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. The resulting 5-volume report was released in 1996 and contained 440 recommendations for how to do that restructuring. So I call on you to work towards implementing the 440 recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. 4, in 2007, the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, was finalized. One of the elements of the agreement was to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada to help foster reconciliation between former students, their families, their communities, and Canadians. And from 2007 to 2015, the TRC documented experiences from over 6,500 witnesses. The findings from this effort formed a multi-volume final report which included 94 calls to action or recommendations to further reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. I call on you to work towards implementing the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Number 5, in 2004, Amnesty International released a report called Stolen Sisters, a human rights response to discrimination and violence against Indigenous women in Canada due to the appalling number of Indigenous women who are victims of racialized and sexualized violence. The Native Women's Association of Canada carried out research and provided awareness about violence against Indigenous women and launched the Sisters in Spirit initiative. It's from this research they developed a national database to track cases of violence against Indigenous women and released a report entitled What Their Stories Tell Us. Research findings from the Sisters in Spirit initiative. The Legal Strategy Coalition on Violence Against Indigenous Women was formed in 2014, and they released a report with over 400 recommendations and calls to action. The same year, in 2014, the Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police also released Missing and Murdered Aboriginal Women, a national operational overview, which documented 1,181 people from 1980 to 2012 victims. These are 1,100 victims, and later added an additional 11 Indigenous women who were missing. In 2015, the Government of Canada launched the National Public Inquiry, and in 2019, the inquiry's final report titled Reclaiming Power and Place was released. More than 2,380 people participated in the National Inquiry, and including testimonies, public hearings, evidence gathering efforts, and contained in a report which included 231 individual legal imperatives or calls for justice for Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersect, and asexual people. I call on you to work towards implementing the 231 calls for justice from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And 6, invest in and support Indigenous communities and economies. This requires corporate Canada to adjust their supply chains and develop Indigenous procurement strategies. It also requires financial institutions to reduce barriers for accessing financing. Capacity building with Indigenous peoples will promote strong investment and equity opportunities as well as strong economic relationships. These are just some of the examples of the work that's happened in Canada, and I believe that there has been a similar amount of work looking at the relationship between the United States and Indigenous peoples here. And so with that, I say please find that out and go do the work. So I'm going to jump into this presentation. Oh, I forgot I translated this in Spanish as well, my notes. So I had some Spanish-speaking people this morning. And so in 2010, I co-founded the Firelight Group with some colleagues and friends. We wanted to do consulting in a very different way, where Indigenous nations we work with drive the process. Much of our work is designed to create and enhance community capacity while producing high-quality research products that support their rights, titles, and interests. At Firelight, we provide a suite of services to Indigenous nations in many areas of our work. We support communities across Canada and the United States in Indigenous knowledge and use studies, ecology, mapping, environmental impact assessment, planning, health, and socioeconomic research work. Can you see that map? It's kind of hard to see on this background. There's a map of North America right here. We feel quite honored to have worked with knowledge holders, Indigenous elders, and community experts to assist them with projects, and are proud to influence change in a positive way for Indigenous nations. Firelight has become the leader in Indigenous-led studies. Our approach focuses on the things that matter most to Indigenous nations we are working for. The nation decides the research agenda, and our job is to support them by carrying this out. And we design every project with the intent of building or enhancing skills at the community level so that they may take this work on into the future. So I love maps. I'm a cartographer by trade. I've been trained in the traditional forms of cartography, and I've seen mapping evolve over the past 25 years. And in my experience, maps have always been used as a tool for communication. But the underlying notion of a map is an exertion of power and knowledge. It's the idea that the person that holds the pen wields the power to define place and space. By consciously excluding Indigenous peoples from the map, it reinforces the idea that no one is here and it can be colonized by foreign interests. Indigenous peoples have been using maps to decolonize. And while decolonizing the map, Indigenous peoples are also indigenizing the map. So as a cartographer, I've worked with Indigenous peoples to support them on communicating and asserting their rights and interests through maps. And in a past lifetime, I used to work in carpentry. I was a cabinet maker. And mapping is very similar to that trade in that I'd learned to use a variety of tools to create those pieces of work. For example, I'd use a hammer to nail a piece of wood, or I'd use a saw to cut the piece of wood. And I guess if I was to use the hammer and hit it hard enough, I could probably break the wood, but it wouldn't have that nice clean edge that the saw does. And so mapping and the GIS technologies that we use are very similar in that way, in that there's tools that do those jobs very well and those tasks very well. There are multiple ways to tell a story, and understanding your audience will determine how to apply each of these elements of storytelling. The role of the cartographer is to translate data, analysis, and outputs in a way that's inclusive and that everyone can understand. So this map that you see on the right here, it's a map of New France by Alexis Hubert Jalot in 1685. And you can see that it's got coastlines and rivers and some place names, but they've consciously excluded Indigenous peoples from this map. And it's that idea that it reinforced the idea that no one was here and it could be colonized by foreign interests. Maps, in this case, were used to assert power and control over large tracts of lands and waters. It's important to note that although the physicality of the landscape remains relatively constant, the templates of boundaries and names do not. The Canada as we know it today, and similar to the United States, would look a lot different in the eyes of colonizers. These maps never took into account that there were people living on these lands long before Europeans arrived, who had place names, had sovereignty, had governance, had jurisdiction of family territories, had sacred places, and common travel routes. And as we look at the maps, like this one here that was produced in 1763 by Andrew DeRoy, it was produced after the Indian and French War, the French and Indian War. And we can see that the landscape is shifting and new lines are being drawn and new places are being mapped. And while it shows some of the indigenous groups, especially in the South and West Appalachians, we can see that many of the places are actually being renamed and restoried. And so when we think about these places, and we think about those Europeans that first came to this land, they were challenged with understanding Indigenous nations and their languages. And this is an example from this universal history. These descriptions of how Indigenous groups spoke don't go into the why those places matter, or those perspectives of place and space are important. They only talk about how Indigenous groups spoke. And by being ignorant to the long-standing Indigenous relationship to place and space, large swaths of territories were renamed and restoried. So I want to just take a little bit of time to give you the context of Indigenous peoples in Canada and give you a little bit of a history lesson here. So this is a map. I really like this map. This one says historic treaties, as if it's a thing of the past, a relic of the past. Treaties were established between the Crown and the King and Queen of England and Indigenous peoples from 1725 to 1923. This includes the peace and friendship treaties here on the East Coast, the Upper Canada land surrenders, the Robinson treaties here in the purple, the Douglas treaties, the Numbers treaties, and the Williams treaties. So these are the numbered treaties here. And it starts with Treaty 1, 2, 3, it goes up to 11. So, and so it goes all the way up into the Northwest Territories. I'm actually from this part right here, which is Treaty number 2. And on my medallion, this is actually a map of our treaty territory. So I'm from these two beads in the middle where the yellow are. That's where my dad's community and my mom's community is from. And so when we actually look at this map, it's interesting because it contextualizes this notion that those treaties are historic, they're a thing of the past, and we don't actually need to deal with them. But for Indigenous peoples, we're dealing with constantly having to defend and affirm our treaty rights on a daily basis. By the way, these boundaries are actually incorrect. And I went through an exercise where we were doing a historical atlas of Manitoba, and we were doing the meets and bounds of each of these boundaries. And when the treaties were originally negotiated, they were using a cartographic representation of those boundaries. And because the maps were incorrect, the meets and bounds were incorrect. So now when you actually try to map, say, for example, in Treaty number 4 in this part, there's actually like a figure 8. It doesn't actually do a nice, smooth, connected line. It creates this kind of weird kind of figure 8. And that's because they were using cartographic representations instead. Since the establishment of the treaties, Indigenous peoples have fought to have their rights recognized by Canada. And this map illustrates the boundaries of the signed comprehensive land claims and self-government agreements between First Nations and the Canadian government. These agreements have been ratified and brought into effect since the announcement of the Government of Canada's Comprehensive Land Claims Policy in 1973 and the establishment of the BC Treaty Process in 1992. So after the treaty-making process, the government essentially has set up this act. It was called the Indian Act. And that was established in 1876, and it's still in place today. It's the only act in the world that governs people. And these are some of the examples of some of the rules that are in the act. But it's used to control most aspects of Indigenous people's lives. And it really focused on 3 main areas. It focused on band councils, the reserved lands, and their membership. And its primary purpose is to control Indigenous peoples and assimilate them into Canada. What's interesting about this map or this picture on the top right here, this is actually a permission slip. And so as a First Nations person, you needed a permission slip to leave the reserve. So if you've ever heard of the term, that person's gone off the reservation, it's actually a racist term, and it's a derogatory term, and it actually is about us as Indigenous peoples. If we were caught off the reserve without one of these permission slips, we could be fined, we could be jailed, and or arrested. There was a number of things that could have happened to us, and so that kind of looking at the broad treaties and narrowing down to these smaller reserve parcels really forced us into these, what I would call kind of like an internment area, where we were only supposed to be in these places. And then in 1930, the Natural Resources Transfer Act was put into place, where the federal government devolved control over all lands and resources to the provincial governments, similar to here, from the federal government to the state. And so the First Nation reserves and lands reserved for Indigenous peoples, as well as national parks, were actually excluded under the Indian Act. And so what it did was it created this issue for the continuance of Indigenous peoples to access wild foods, subsistence activities, economic development, and other rights-based activities. So it created this quasi-jurisdictional boundary issue, where are we dealing with the provincial government, are we dealing with the federal government? And this Natural Resources Transfer Act has caused many problems for many Indigenous peoples in Canada. So this is where we are today. This is a map that shows all the different nations across the country. And in 2017, Firelight worked with Google to put Indigenous peoples onto their base maps. And so you can see on this map, you can see the First Nations are represented by these yellow stars. The green circles are Inuit communities. The red squares are Métis. The purple stars are First Nations that are not federally recognized First Nations. And the blue balloons represent the tribal councils. The reason why we were doing this, to give you some background around this, was because we were doing training with Indigenous peoples, and we were using Google tools to map. And we would go, a community member from a far north community would say, okay, well, I want to go see my home. And they'd go fly to their home, and they wouldn't be able to even see their imagery for their home. They wouldn't be able to see any of the features. And so it spawned this real response from Google to make sure that Indigenous peoples were represented on their maps. So I commend them for taking leadership in ensuring that Indigenous peoples are on their platforms. And for the past 2 years, I've been working with, Firelight's been working with Apple Maps to ensure Indigenous lands are represented on their platforms. In addition to having lands represented, Indigenous place names are being added to the map, as well as the pronunciations being supported by Siri. So here you can see on this map, you can see the reservations from this far out. And that was a big ask to ask Apple to ensure that Indigenous lands are represented from a very far, like looking at the whole country. And they actually changed all of their, this is an interesting background, they changed all of their line work to be able to ensure that Indigenous lands are matching the same boundary colors as the state and federal boundaries, not just for the United States, but for around the globe. So they changed all of their line work for those federal boundaries to be matching with Indigenous lands because of the nation-to-nation responsibility that Indigenous peoples have with the federal government. So that was I commend Apple for being that responsive. So how do we apply maps to Indigenous peoples today? And from my perspective, I think we need to take a rights-based approach. And the Constitution Act, which was created, what created Canada as an independent and sovereign nation from the British Crown, is relatively new and was created within my lifetime in 1982. Indigenous leaders before us fought to ensure that our rights were acknowledged and protected under Section 35, and for them I'm grateful for that work. And those rights include the right to cultural, social, political, and economic, the right to land, the right to logging, the right to fish, hunt, practice one's own culture, the right to establish and enforce treaties. But today, it's very important to understand how these rights, what these rights are and how we can apply them in a modern context. So in our work with Indigenous peoples, when we look at this rights-based framework, we need to develop an understanding of these particular issues. We need to understand Indigenous rights, title, and interests. We need to understand jurisdiction, and we need to understand legal precedents. So please note, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a cartographer. I make maps. But these are just some of the few cases that have illustrated the importance of consultation and accommodation between the Crown and Indigenous nations. And the burden of proving Indigenous rights is on the Indigenous nations themselves. So we constantly have to keep fighting the Canadian government to ensure that our rights are acknowledged and enforced. And so when we look at some of these cases, some of these are pretty new, like the Yahe case just happened recently. And it's constantly defining and redefining the Indigenous-Crown relationship. But what these case laws have demonstrated is that the government has a fiduciary duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples. But then when we think about that, how do we think about that? What does that mean in practice? And so when we think about the context of resource development, from an Indigenous perspective, there's a lot of pressure for a wide variety of resource development to occur in our territories, from forestry, from natural resource like extraction, like natural gas, hydro, and then in the context of conservation, the idea of protecting the land from resource development also has implications on Indigenous people's interests. For example, some nations want to see development take place in a sustainable manner that provides opportunities for wealth creation for their members. There are so many interests in the landscape that need to be taken into consideration, but Indigenous people's rights, titles, and interests are often seen as an afterthought. We certainly don't want to develop the land to a point where our rights are negatively affected. So this is a picture of the LNG, the liquefied natural gas, and the pipelines that are created as a result of that. And so when you hear of something like clean energy, or you hear of like LNG, it's the cleanest energy. For us, it actually is the most destructive in our territories because it creates these permanent infrastructures that will be there forever now that you've built a pipeline in those regions. And so that fragments our territory. And so when you're looking at a situation like the Tsilhqot'in, we've had to rely on the courts to affirm not only our Indigenous rights, but Indigenous title to our territories. And so this is an example, I don't know if you can see that map, but this is the Tsilhqot'in's territory in the light green that goes all the way around here. And then in the middle area is what they've actually, under the Supreme Court, they've actually proven Indigenous title to those lands. And so in order to do this, tailored research to demonstrate ongoing occupation is required. And according to the Supreme Court decision laid out by Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, occupation must be sufficient, continuous, and exclusive. And so when we think about the research that needs to go into that, we need to think about those particular issues around sufficiency, continuous, and exclusive. This is an example for the Blueberry River First Nations where the pace of and extent of resource development has significantly affected their Treaty 8 rights. So this is in Treaty 8 territory, they occupy a much larger area, but this red area is where they kind of have their consultation area. And this is all the resource development in 2015 when they brought their court case to their case to the courts. And this case is significant because it meant that the province couldn't just take up lands to an extent that infringes their treaty rights, but rather the Crown, in this case the province acting on behalf of the Crown, must act with diligence and integrity to implement and protect the purpose and promise of Treaty 8. So when I look at a map like that, I think, okay, well, where can I practice my rights? Well, you can see there's some of these smaller areas that are at the fringes of their territory, but they're very hard to get to because this is the Rocky Mountains and there's not a lot of access to get to some of these places, unless you have a helicopter. And so on the international stage, Indigenous peoples worldwide have been advocating for the recognition of their rights, titles, and interests. And please note that I did talk about the 46 articles of UNDRIP, but these constitute the minimum standards for what's required for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples of the world. So here's a few examples of UNDRIP that talk about the right to self-determination, the right to autonomy and self-government, the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, the right to lands, territories, and resources, which they've traditionally owned. But one of the most important things that I think is really critical within this declaration is a recognition that institutions must obtain free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous peoples for activities that may affect their lands, territories, or resources. So for us, this was a major success for Indigenous peoples of the world. So what is FPIC? Well, FPIC deals with providing adequate information to all participants in advance of any engagement to ensure they are informed for how the research results will be used. Efforts will need to be taken towards gaining consent from knowledge holders without coercion. And so, in line with some of the previous court cases that dealt with consultation and accommodation, UNDRIP identifies a path forward towards earning consent from Indigenous peoples. And so if we think about consent, we can think of it in this manner. This might help us understand what consent is. Think about date night. And so for FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, it allows Indigenous peoples to give or withhold consent without coercion. It also enables Indigenous peoples to conduct their own independent discussions and decision making. And so these are some of the ways in which FPIC can be applied in community-led processes. One of the first steps in applying FPIC is really talking about introducing and explaining your project and explaining the who, what, where, when, why, and how your project or initiative is going to be used. Using and enforcing confidentiality agreements and usage protocols for those outputs. Developing a data management plan right from the outset and thinking about how you're going to store your data. And then finally looking at how you might back up your data on a regular basis. And we follow the 3-2-1 rule, where you have 3 total copies of your data, 2 of which are local but on different mediums, and 1 is at least offsite. And then another principle that I wanted to bring forward is the notion of OCAP, or ownership, control, access, and possession. OCAP was designed by the First Nations Governance Center with the intent to provide Indigenous data governance principles. So any information that's created and about Indigenous peoples should reflect on this principle. All right, let's see here. Okay, some examples of good research methods include the following resources. And so I encourage you to seek out these as well as any other methods as you pursue your research in your academic career. So I want to talk about this idea around indigenizing the map. What does that actually mean? And how do Indigenous peoples go through this process of indigenizing the map? And so Indigenous mapping is where the community drives the process, decides what to map or what not to map for that matter. And maps are not new to Indigenous peoples. We've been using them for generations to share our stories around Indigenous rights. But one of the earliest examples I can give you about maps is that our ancestors used the stars. And by knowing the placement of the stars, our ancestors were able to navigate to locations on the landscape and on the water. In some communities, this star knowledge has been passed down through generations and continues to be used today. The outcome of an effective community-led engagement process looks something like this. The nation can go through a process of restoring place and space. It can be an important healing exercise in which that positions the nation's interests in the forefront. And it changes the narrative from go elsewhere to identifying preferred areas. And so working with Indigenous peoples around the world, we've developed and refined what we call the directed-digital mapping method, or D2D mapping. And this was in response to shortened timelines for us as Indigenous peoples to respond to major development applications in our territories. We had to be innovative and we had to adapt technologies in order to suit our needs. And so this is what it looks like. We'll use Google Earth as our base map. We'll project it up onto the wall. And in a digital environment, we can actually zoom quite close into the landscape, and we can see features. Like here, you can see the road here, and you can see the river, and you can see individual trees and their shadows. And so we can get really precise accuracy and accurate information about those places on the landscape. And then we can also tilt the map into a three-dimensional view where we can actually start seeing the landscape in a three-dimensional view that's a little bit more realistic for people. And we've vertically exaggerated the land to show those mountains, but this gives us an example of how we can add mapped features right on top of that imagery in a 3D space. And so we'll organize our data in Google Earth, and we'll create folders and subfolders of our data. And so that's one of the first steps, is to make sure that our information is easily retrievable. And then we'll organize, and we use a coding system for those sites using the name field in the dialog box that pops up when you add a feature, as well as the description field that gives us some notes about the site, including some dates and who might be involved, and other descriptions about that site. And so when we carry out one of these research studies, these are some of the activities that we will go through in order to actively and properly engage Indigenous peoples. And so the goal is to create a positive research environment that is driven by the community to achieve their goals and their aspirations. And so when we think about engagement, we think about, at least I think about these kind of these considerations. So one, for example, is the language that we're using, ensuring that everyone understands what you're actually talking, what you are actually talking about. And we've often heard the saying, just speak plain English. And that it's participatory, ensuring that community champions are actively involved in the data collection and collective and decision-making processes. And we encourage consensus-based decision-making where everyone's voice counts. And then we want to make sure that our research is inclusive, that we're involving all aspects of the community, from elders to young people to women to men, and that it's designed in collaboration with community-based champions so that the cultural protocols and practices are respected and honored in this process. We take a verification-focused approach, meaning that we bring the results back to the community to say, hey, this is how we've translated the information you've provided to us. Did we get it right? It also provides us an opportunity to do some course correction. And then we want to make sure that we're transparent with ongoing open communication, with regular check-ins and development of report-back summaries of engagement results in an easy-to-read format. Again, going back to that language piece. We want to make sure that the engagement is community-based and community-driven, and recognizing that each community is different and has their own unique needs, and that we can't really just take a one-size-fits-all approach to when we do this engagement. And I talked about this earlier, the idea around being innovative, meaning that we're constantly on the lookout for new methods and tools that will enable community members to participate in community-driven processes. So when we do these mapping exercises, this is kind of what it ends up looking like. In a typical research process, we'll talk to a lot of people, and this person here, this box might represent one person's knowledge and experience, and then we'll go talk to another person, and they'll map a bunch of values, and so on and so forth. And the more people that we talk to, the more values that we're going to start collecting. And when we actually bring that together, what we get is this painted picture of collective knowledge and experiences on the landscape. And so each person's data is brought together and includes values such as hunting, fishing, trapping, berry and plant picking areas, habitation sites, cultural sites, and other places that matter most. And then the research output really produces two distinct types of information. One, which is the site-specific data, so we can randomize and buffer that data and present it in these broad activity classes like the map that we see on the left-hand side. And then we can also make sure that there's also the raw information, like this person actually did this particular activity at this site, but we don't want to give that data away. But we want this information to be useful, so the community will keep that for their internal confidential use. The other piece is that we're going to record the interviews with audio and video cameras, and we're going to actually then transcribe all of that. And that's where the juicy part comes out. That's the narratives, that's the stories that are associated to those random points, lines, and polygons on the map. And so we'll use this analysis to incorporate those testimonies of individuals and include that into a report. And so when we think about data quality metrics, there's two ways to think about it. The one on the left here is what's been termed data diamonds. And data diamonds on a site-by-site basis, you should get at least the who, what, where, and when of each of those values. But what we've noticed through the thousands of interviews that we've completed, we realize that we need to advance our Indigenous spatial data quality metrics. So we've come up with a new standard for data quality, which we're calling data stars. It's a little bit more in line with our epistemology and pedagogy. So we're, in addition to the data diamonds, we're also ensuring that we're documenting the ecological value of the site, the kinship relationship with the value, associated with the value, the Indigenous knowledge transfer that happens at each of those places, and then the relational aspects of each site to other sites in the area. And so we published a paper called Mapping the Digital Terrain Towards Indigenous Geographic Information and Spatial Data Quality Indicators for Indigenous Knowledge and Traditional Land Use Data Collection. And this was in the Cartographic Journal a few years ago. And so how can Indigenous people learn more about mapping and GIS technologies? Well, for far too long, Indigenous peoples have been excluded from the map. So we're changing that. Mapping is a form of storytelling, as I was talking about earlier, and how we tell our stories relies on data, analysis, and presentation. Our culture guides our approach to storytelling, and it's important to know what tools are available and data that are available for us to be able to synthesize. Indigenous mapping requires that we use a variety of tools to achieve our map. So we beg, we borrow, we steal tools, we steal data, we take whatever we can get to support our mapping process. This may involve using open source tools, it may involve using proprietary tools, but we're basically, it's a culmination of all of these different aspects of mapping. And so maps, like I said, are not new to Indigenous peoples. And we're really focusing on the things that matter most. So in an engagement session, we start at this point where we map out all of the different pieces that people want to talk about in terms of the values they want to document. And we try to involve Indigenous peoples so that they're in the driver's seat, leading the data collection process. And there are many ways in which Indigenous mapping data can be collected. And there are many tools that can be used in this collection. So we've seen an adaptation of not only GIS softwares, but mobile data collection tools, both open and proprietary softwares. And so not all data can be shared publicly, but it's important as Indigenous peoples to acknowledge and celebrate that knowledge and stories through maps. And so this is an example of a mapping workshop I did up in northern BC where people were creating their own maps and everyone had a different perspective of what that map should look like this bright red one versus these more kind of natural colors on this map. And so the Indigenous Mapping Workshop was created, and it's been an Indigenous-led event, and it's focused on building a global community of Indigenous mappers. We create safe spaces for Indigenous peoples to talk and share stories, increase their spatial literacy, expose them to the wide variety of technologies and techniques, and advance Indigenous pedagogies and of mapping and research methodologies. So since 2014, we've actually hosted 14 events around the globe. We've done a number of events in Canada. We've done 2 events in Aotearoa. We've done 3 events in Australia, with one that we just did in April of this year. And since the pandemic, we've also shifted to an online virtual space. when the pandemic came, we couldn't do it in person, so we actually created this online forum called the Indigenous Mapping Collective. And we delivered our training through this on-demand kind of site. So what's great about this is it's free for Indigenous peoples. We also have a variety of rates for non-Indigenous members, but it allows people to go and explore those workshops, explore that training, and really dive into some of the tools. And all of our trainers from the different partners that we work with are also members of the collective. And then more recently, in the past year, we've been doing this monthly speaker series where we bring people together and share content such as podcasts, discussions, and opportunities such as jobs and funding. So I encourage you to go check out indigenousmaps.com. We're proud of the global network of Indigenous mappers that we've created. And just so you know, for next year, we're currently planning 3 events to take place in 2024, one in Aotearoa, one in Australia, and one here in Turtle Island. So please check out indigenousmaps.com for those announcements and more information. And so I just want to say, Gitchi Miigwech, thank you for listening, for being attentive. Thank you to the online crowd on Zoom that connected with us today. It's been a real honor to be able to present to you some of the work that I've been doing. So with that, I say Miigwech.
So if you're online, please use the Q&A function, and I'll work with Aaron to get those questions on the mic. And then I'll take hands the old-fashioned way. Anyone here? Oh, Keely's first.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was absolutely, it's such an important time to hear the messages that you're providing, and it's amazing that you've been doing this work for so long. So I'm glad and grateful to the IIC for allowing us the opportunity to understand all these activities. I have a particular question about the data diamond to the data square.
Okay.
Data star. I love that idea, from the data diamond to the data star, but I feel like I don't understand exactly how you, like, what is it, how does it get visualized? What is it that you are capturing that is carried on, and how does it show up visually in a map, or does it? If you could just explain a little bit more about what the data star captures and conveys.
Okay.
Thank you.
So on a site-by-site basis, let's say we're talking to a community member who goes out and hunts. And maybe they go hunt deer, for example. You have deer here, right? Yeah. So, way too many. Okay. In an example where we used to map, we might say, okay, well, Bob would go hunting for deer, and he'd get the deer in this particular place, and sometimes we might get the when, but often it was usually these 3 things that would get mapped out. And as we realized, we needed more context around what that means to hunt deer. And so we needed to go a little bit more in depth into why the deer are in this particular area. So we're looking at the ecological content of that place. We're also looking at who's going out with that person. So it might be Bob and his brothers that are hunting, and they're basically getting 2 deer, and they're going to distribute the meat to their family. And so, so part of that is that kinship relationship, but it's also the Indigenous knowledge transfer. They're teaching each other, they're working together, and they're collecting that information, or they're getting those animals. And then we're talking about the relational aspect. So we're talking about that one site of, this is a deer hunting site, but it might be in an area that might be ecologically significant for the nation. There might be a mineral site close by, and that's why the deer are coming to that area, because they're going to this place. So that mineral site also becomes an important area. So that's where the relational aspect comes into place. So what we've done is we've augmented each of the sites that we're collecting to not just look at the who, what, and where, which is a point on the map, the person and the activity, but we're actually collecting all this extra data on a site-by-site basis, so that when we look at all of those values at the end of a mapping project. We might have thousands of mapping sites. Now we might be able to actually have a little bit more context about the richness of that value and the importance of that value. And so it's not necessarily are we trying to get every single deer hunting site, but we're actually trying to say, well, why does this place matter? Why is it so important? And if we look at all of these pieces together as a data star, we're actually collecting really high quality data on a site-by-site basis. Does that answer your question?
Beautiful, thank you.
That was a great
Okay.
example.
Yeah.
Who's next?
Oh, yes, in the back.
Erin.
Thank you so much. Hi, I have a question from Camille Andrews in the chat. She says, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I was also glad to hear you talk so much about data. I was wondering if and how the OCAP principle might be in conversation with the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. Thanks.
Yes. Exactly. And I think when we think about data principles, these are just two examples, FPIC and OCAP. There's also CARE. There's also a number of other different data principles, but I think it's important as you carry out your research to really think about how do these apply and that you integrate them into your research process. And that a lot of that work happens at the very beginning. You're going to think about the story that you're trying to tell. You're going to think about who the audience is. You're going to think about where is this information going to be used or not used. And then you're going to apply these data principles that are appropriate for the work that you're trying to do. And so in some cases, like sometimes we might be retained by a lawyer or a law firm, and they're going to say, we're going to court, and we want you to make sure that we have you on retainer and that you can do this work. And it's like really highly sensitive. And so we're going to try to implement all of these different data principles, as many as possible. So I'm going to add that CARE principle to my presentation so I have it for the next time. So thanks for raising that. Or it might be a different type project where maybe the community wants to celebrate their data and their knowledge, and they want to tell a story that's public facing, and they want to use a tool that's going to be on the internet. And so you might not apply some of these principles in those contexts. So I think the point is that we want to really think about the data, where it's going to be used, how it's going to be used, who's going to have access, and then apply those principles appropriately. Yes.
Hi, hello, thank you very much. It was such a wonderful presentation, and I got very excited, particularly on the Indigenous Mapping Workshop, and the the methodology that you had for digital maps, where you use Google Earth.
Yeah.
I come from the experience of the Global South. I work particularly in Honduras and Nicaragua, and in Mexico. In Honduras, in particularly, it has been a site of numerous participatory mapping projects on the Mosquito Coast, from Mac Chapin, Peter Herlihy from the 1990s or so on, and they were very important projects for allowing the Mosquito people to be able to make claims over their land rights. But in some ways, those processes have stayed with the map as a finished product and not so much as mapping as a process, right? And I think that what you show in your workshop, that is about building capacities, so people are able then to map anything that they need to be mapped in the ways that they want to map it and in the ways that they want to share it, right? So it's about building capacities. And of course, I mean, like, there are many plights that are similar with indigenous peoples in the Global South and in settler societies here in Canada and the US, but there are also very stark differences in terms of resources and capacities. So I'm just wondering if in your organization, if you have given any consideration about how to do similar kinds of mapping workshops, perhaps in other countries, in different languages, and maybe if you have any advice about how to start something, particularly in a context where there is a significant lack of resources, and where might you prioritize, right, some of these actions that will need to happen to do something like what you have been doing in Canada.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And we actually had 3 workshops planned for South America. We were supposed to do one in Peru, in Guatemala, and Colombia. And then the pandemic happened, and then we had to reorganize and regroup. And we had to cancel the Peru one that we had. I was literally supposed to fly there 2 weeks after the pandemic started. So it was just bad timing. In those contexts, working in low internet situations, there are actually quite a lot of tools that you can actually apply in those scenarios. So the one thing that I love about Google Earth is that it's a desktop tool that downloads onto your computer. It doesn't need a Wi-Fi signal. There's this process where I talk about where you can fly over the landscape and you can download all the imagery. They call it caching the imagery, and it's stored on your computer. You basically turn off the Wi-Fi, you go to the community, and you've got all that imagery for that area. And so it's a great tool. That's what I love about Google Earth, is that's a great tool to work in an offline space. But there's also mobile mapping tools that we can use our phones, that we can actually just go out and do our data collection using mobile mapping techniques. And so there's a number of both free and proprietary softwares that people can actually use to do that. And so I think it goes back to that whole idea around mapping as one tool in the toolbox that you're going to use. And the tools that you use in that toolbox, they're each going to have like a really good use and a really not so good use. So one of the things you have to think about is evaluating all those tools across the board and saying which one works for your context, which one works for the type of story that you're trying to tell. And then but part of that is learning all those tools and saying, okay, well, let's try this tool against that tool and see which one works for us. And that's where the Indigenous Mapping Workshop really kind of does that, is that we expose people to like a wide variety of tools. So we've got partnerships with Google, with Esri, with NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, with Apple Maps wants to be a part of it. So there's all these mapping tools that are actually a part of, they come here and they teach people how to apply their tools. And we say, okay, well, here's one example that you might use in a mobile data collection scenario. And here's another tool that you might use in a similar scenario. Try them both and figure out which one works best for your case. And so we're a little bit software agnostic in that sense, that we're not saying go pick this tool. We're saying test drive it and see what works for you, and then you decide what works best for you. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, great.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you so much, Steve. I am thinking back to your map where you first talked about where your family is from, where your tribal lands are, and I look at that and it looks like you're on what is now the U.S.-Canada border.
Close.
And I'm curious, this is an assumption, but before the U.S. was there and Canada was there was not that border. And I'm thinking of how the establishment of these two nation states and that boundary impacted the relationships, the intertribal relationships between, say, I don't know if you're near North Dakota, like the Dakota, Lakota, Mandan. I'm wondering how Indigenous mapping might restructure or rebuild or acknowledge those intertribal cross nation-state boundary relationships.
Absolutely. We call it the medicine line, that Canada-US border. And before these lands were actually separated by these arbitrary lines, people lived in both places. And so one of the things that, as Canadian First Nations, we have a thing called the Jay Treaty. So it allows First Nations in Canada to be able to come into the States, in the United States, without having any barriers. It's like as if the boundary doesn't exist. And so we can live and work and we can shop, and it would be like as if there's no boundary for us as First Nations from Canada. For First Nations in the U.S. or in tribal organizations and tribal peoples in the U.S., it's not the same for them to come into Canada. So that was through what's called the Jay Treaty back in several years ago, and it still applies today. So we have a lot of nations that are doing mapping projects that are both north and south of the border, where their family ties are so interconnected. And so we have some examples where we're doing some work in southern British Columbia and northern Washington State, where it's like those boundaries actually don't even exist because those relationships are so strong, and there's so much intertribal marrying and families connected that it's as if those, like I said, the boundary doesn't exist. So Yeah, that's the thing about lines on maps. They have a major impact, and I'm really cautious about putting these massive polygons like this, what you see on the map, these big areas, these big polygons, and one of the things where I find them to be very, I would say, challenging is that there's room for a whole lot of interpretation about what those lines actually mean. So in some cases, those lines actually might represent lands and resources issues. In other cases, those lines actually might represent census. Or in other cases, it might represent education or health. And so what happens with these lines is that they get misinterpreted. And so that's the problem is that as Indigenous peoples is that we have to control the narrative and control what they mean, but also what they don't mean. And so they can't be misused and misinterpreted in the future. And so, yeah, anyway, that's a little rant on the line work. But to answer your question, yes, we do have work that does go north and south of the border. Yeah. Was there any questions over here? Yeah, I think there's someone over here. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, hi, thanks. This is fascinating. I know a lot of questions, but I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the conservation aspects of the work your company does, if you've been involved in projects like that. And a related question involves, another difference between the United States and Canada is that Canada is still making treaties with First Nations, specifically in BC, which is contentious. I'm wondered if your group has been involved in that work of trying to negotiate these agreements between the provincial government and First Nations there, which is also all tangled up with issues like pipelines, being forced through there.
Yeah. So a lot of the work that we do is in the impact assessment realm, so environmental impact assessment. So you've got in the United States the EPA, which looks at evaluating impacts from large-scale energy. We've got something very similar called the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency that does that. And so a lot of the negotiations are not looking at these broad territory-wides, but they're looking at a project-by-project basis, where we're looking at, say, a potential developer that wants to come in and build their project, and we're supporting the nation to actually engage on that project and be involved in those discussions and better understand what that project is, understand what the impacts of that project are on their values, and then based on that information, go through a negotiations process to better understand how those rights are going to be impacted. So, so a lot of our work in that realm is really looking at these kind of overlapping projects. In some cases, some nations have 20, 30 major projects. Like I'm talking about 100-year mining projects in their backyard. And so what does that actually mean in terms of the impact on their rights and title issues? So we go through these exercises of documenting Indigenous knowledge and land use. We document the socioeconomic conditions of the community. We document health. We document education. And we use all of these baseline studies to better inform and understand and link to what the actual project is to better understand what those impacts can be. And so we find that if we can tie it to specific aspects of the project, we can better then suggest mitigations or ways that we can then reduce the impacts on those values that have been brought forward. And so that's, as part of the consultation and accommodation law, basically a nation has to go through the exercise of bringing that data forward. They're going to say, well, tell us if we're going to impact you. And then the community is like, well, we got to go through that exercise of doing that research. And it's only at that point that we can present the research that then they can say, okay, now what are you going to do about this? Developer number 1 or developer number 30. And so it goes through this kind of this back and forth exercise of presenting information in a way that the developer understands, presenting it in a way that the government understands. And so we have to really think about all those different players that are at the table. We're not only talking to the resource developers, but we're talking to the provincial government agencies, the municipalities, the conservation groups. We're talking to the various government agencies that are involved. We're talking to the federal government. So there's all these different people that all are like, well, what does that actually mean? And how does it affect their interests? So that's where this context of all of these players that are at the table is thinking about And so part of our work is really trying to target it to those projects and better understand that, and then allowing the nation to be in the driver's seat to then negotiate. Well, if they do want that project to go ahead, part of this is weighing the gains and the losses. So the gains might be, okay, we might get some jobs out of this, we might get some contracting opportunities, we might get a payout, we might get other training opportunities, there might be some tangible benefits. But the costs might be a loss of culture, a loss of a way of life, loss of access to those places, loss of access to clean drinking water. And part of that exercise of doing those baseline studies is to really better understand whether or not this project is going to have a loss or an impact to their rights or a gain to those rights. And then from that process, it's not our position to decide what they should do. It's really our job is about providing that evidence so that they can make an informed decision to say, well, we think this project, if they develop it in these ways, that maybe it could go ahead. Or maybe that the losses are too great that we probably should be going and looking at a settlement or negotiating some stronger environmental mitigations. So part of the research that we do is really contextualizing it in that very particular scenario to really target the results to be useful, to be informing that decision-making process, and to really enable the nation to have a voice at those conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm super glad I attended this because even though, so I'm a doctoral student here in archaeology, and even though my master's project was all GIS map making based, I am still such a novice when it comes to this world, and so there's so much to learn. Anyways, I'm a little bit curious. So for my own dissertation work, I plan to do some participatory mapping in Puerto Rico, in a community I'm working with. And I just spend a lot of time thinking about how to connect what you mentioned in your presentation as qualitative data. So oral historical accounts, what people say, ethnographic information. Really, I just think of them as people's memories and stories that are tied to place so intimately. How do you visualize these types of things in what is essentially a two-dimensional space? And is there a way to take this qualitative information and make the map more textured, right? And what is your experience doing that? Does it look like finding themes in interviews and using those to inform the map, or is it more of, providing actual links that I guess navigate somebody to a recording of an oral history? I'm exploring all of these opportunities because it does require me to put on the creative hat a little bit, and I just would like to hear a little bit more about how you engage with that.
Okay. Yeah, great question. Thanks for raising it. And I think maybe to answer your question, is this slide looking at what kind of research activities might take place when you're doing that engagement? And that very first step, that very first engagement, should be you should be engaging your curious brain, because at that point it's really about trying to understand what the goals are for the community in terms of understanding what their story is that they want to tell, what they want to get out of this research process. So kind of removing your interest from that process and saying, well, what does the community actually want? And maybe they don't actually want what you're thinking that they want. And so we usually start with a kickoff meeting, and we'll really explore that. We'll say, what are you hoping to get out of this research process? And then based on some of that, we'll say, okay, well, what kind of information might you have? And we'll go talk about some of the background information that they might have. Maybe they've done some studies in the past, and we'll review that material so that we're not reinventing the wheel, but that we're actually filling some of the gaps that might exist in the research that was already completed. And then it's only from there that you're actually going to then develop your methods. You're going to really think about the kinds of questions you're going to be asking. And that's where you had all the people kind of writing all those values. So like that would be an exercise that I might actually go to the community and say, well, let's talk about the things that you want to actually document and map out. What are some of the most important plants that you might be using? What are some of the most important fish that you might be catching? What are some of the most important animals that you're eating? What are some of the birds that you might get? And you might go through this exercise of exploring each of those things. And I did a session just a few months ago where we had this big community meeting in this big hall, and it was like, just yell out the animals that you think you're gonna, the fish that you eat, and people would just yell out, say, they'd name all these different types of fish, and we just started writing them down, and we'd be like, okay, this, and we'd say, okay, well, here's what we've heard so far. We've heard of all these fish that you guys actually eat. Are there other fish that we need to be thinking about? And then we say, oh, you forgot this other fish, or, and then we go through the process of understanding the other values. So we take that exercise of really exploring what the things are that matter most to the community in order to drive that research process. And it's only at that point when we know that, then we can develop our methods and the kind of questions that we're going to ask. So when we're in an interview setting, we might sit down with the person and we'll say, well, do you fish? And they might say, nope, I'm not a fisher. I hate fishing, but I sure do love berry picking. And then we'll have a whole question about all the different types of berries that we explored earlier in that community meeting, where we'll say, okay, well, what kind of berries do you get? And do you get these types of berries or those kind of berries? And we'll go through, and the research is really targeted to the individual and their collective and their experience. And so we go through that exercise where we're mapping this person's experience and then that person's experience and so on and so forth. And over time, we just start to get this really beautiful picture of all these different types of activities and values that are important to the nation. And so there's these different points of engagement. There's the kickoff meeting, there's the scoping meeting and understanding that. There's the actual primary data collection research where we're doing interviews. And it's at that point that we're going to record all this, and we're going to get the most amazing stories. And I've got some really funny experiences where we've done interviews with people, and and in some cases, it's like this walk down memory lane for people, where they're like, okay, can you tell me about that deer that you got at that place? Who were you with? And they're like, well, I was with my dad. And how old were you? Oh, well, I was only 13 when we went and got that deer. And maybe that was the first deer that guy got, and his dad's gun jammed, and so now it was his turn to take the shot, and that experience of like going through that and documenting that, and you listening and being a part of that, kind of sharing that story. It's transformative because all of a sudden people are listening to them, and they're putting value to what those activities are. And people often walk out of that interview setting and they're feeling great because it was like a walk down memory lane, and maybe their dad's not here anymore, or maybe their cousins aren't here, or their grandparents are gone. But it was really nice to sit down and think about that, and for someone to actually take the time to actually listen to those stories. And then at the end, you get this recording that you get these juicy bits about why that deer was so important. So in that case, maybe there's the first deer that they shot, and they might talk about what they did with the deer. Well, we went and we processed it right on site. We gutted it, we skinned it, we cut up the meat in this way. And it was really important for us because we were able to bring it back to the community and give it to the elders in the community. Well, that's a juicy bit. That's like that's the beyond the little dot on the map. That's the juicy bits that say this is why that value is so important, because it talks about that cultural continuity. It talks about that responsibility of that individual to share that meat. It talks about the interconnectedness between that person and their broader community. And so when we do that analysis of those audio files and that qualitative information, it produces some of the most fascinating responses, and that's the thing that if you just take the time to listen to and let people talk about that, and you design your methods in a way that elicit that kind of response, then yeah, you'll get some really powerful information. Yeah. And then at the same time, we might do site visits, we might go check out those places, and then we might then come back to the community and say, here's what we've heard, here's how we've interpreted all of these values that you've identified as a community, and did we get it right? And so you've got all these points of engagement. You've got the kickoff meeting, you've got the scoping meeting, you've got the interviews, you've got the visit to the various sites, you've got the verification meeting. That's 5 really valuable engagements that you'll carry out with that community in the course of that project. And you might even do more than that. Like, you might do more than 1 site visit. You might do maybe 3 trips to the community to do those interviews. But I think the importance is building that relationship, earning that trust with the community, and treating that information like it's gold, because it is gold. And, you know, for someone to share that knowledge and share that experience, that's pretty special. Did I answer your question? Okay, yeah.
So can we do one more online?
You okay, Steve?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
Steve's working hard today. Thank you,
I'm
Steve.
good, I'm good.
All right, thank you. So I have 2 questions in the chat right now, and they're both related to like cartography elements. So I'm going to kind of blend them together for the audience. So the first one is, how do you visualize nation boundaries that overlap, or boundaries that you are uncertain of because the information has been lost, or because the concept of a hard boundary on the landscape is a colonizer's idea that's being imposed? And then the second, in relation, is about the concept of, it's a reference to colonial cartographic violence and the context of the vision between land and ocean. So in Indigenous mapping, how do you incorporate and honor the significance of the ocean? What methodologies or perspectives do you find particularly impactful in representing the intricate relationship between Indigenous communities in the vast expanse of the ocean?
Yeah, that's a hard question. It's a good question. I really appreciate it. So, I kind of gave you my perspective on those big, broad polygons and those big boundary data sets, and I find them to be they're a challenge in that they can be quite divisive. And I've seen nations fighting because of lines on maps. And I've seen relationships between families break down because of those lines on maps. And so I think if you went through an exercise, kind of like what we've seen here on this slide here, where you've got these kind of mapped values, you can derive kind of an extent of use. And that's not, we're not talking about occupancy, we're talking about use, meaning that people are using a broader area beyond their homelands that might be able to, in order to sustain that right. And so if you talk to enough people, you get to this saturation point where you're like, well, we're not getting any new data. We've got a pretty good data set. And this might include thousands of values on the map. And at that point, then you can actually start to get an understanding of the extent of those use areas to say, here's where the broad areas are that people are currently using. Now, they might not be definitive, they might not be in perpetuity, but for now, in order to sustain this, right, and looking at the ecosystem health, this is where people are currently going. And so I say do that research first before you start drawing those polygons and those lines and believing in that. And then the second part to your question, looking at ocean resources, well, if you did a similar exercise where you're, instead of looking at land-based activities, you're looking at ocean-based activities, you can do this mapping, you can derive those areas. And we've actually done a lot of marine studies where we're looking at marine resources where people are fishing and they're going and collecting certain shellfish and things like that. And you can actually take the same approach, but do it in an ocean setting. And so I would just encourage you to kind of follow this method to get something like this as well around those marine areas. Did I answer that question? Okay.
Thank you. And we'll call it there.
Okay.
Steve has had a very long day, and please join me in thanking Steve for DeRoy for joining us.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you joining us today, your enthusiasm for being here, your engagement with our community. Thank you. Thank you all for spending this afternoon with us. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. We want to thank the Center for Geospatial Analysis and the University of Richmond for partnering with us on this special event for GIS Day. I want to thank the IIC team, in particular Anita Hagee-Ferguson and Kathy Francillo, without whom these events would never happen. And this really wraps up our event series for this semester. Please join our listserv if you want to find out about more events. Next semester, we'll be launching the Conservation Lecture Series again in the spring. And if you join our listserv, go to our website, join our listserv, you'll find out all about those events. If you're looking for a fun GIS week activity, check out Speed Dating with a Map. Tomorrow, 5 to 6:30, students from William & Mary's Geovisualization and Cartography class will be introducing visitors to the blind dates they had with maps in the William & Mary Swem Library Special Collections. Where is that? In Special Collections in Swem Library tomorrow from 5 to 6:30, Speed Dating with Maps. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of your evening. Happy GIS Day. Happy GIS Day.